now available in paperback. From the author of the critically acclaimed book The Man Crisis comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback at Amazon.com and online booksellers today. Historical Women in Crisis. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series. And for this episode of the Historical Women in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about birth control advocate and founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. All images used in this video are under fair use of United States copyright law of 1976 and are used in conjunction with my commentary. Now, Margaret Sanger was the feminist who went out here and advocated for birth control. And as Margaret Sanger advocated for birth control, she basically sent most of America's women down the road to becoming women in crisis. Now, Margaret Sanger herself started out on the road to becoming a woman in crisis when she was born into a family in 1879. Now, Margaret Sanger was born to a so-called free-thinking atheist stonemason father, Michael Hennessy Higgins, and a mother, Anne Purcell Higgins. And as Margaret Sanger was born into a family of 11 children, I believe what happened with Margaret Sanger was she felt invisible in being a part of that family as the sixth of 11 children, and because she saw all of her siblings basically getting more attention than her, this is what motivated Margaret Sanger to look to try to control the births of other women because she felt powerless about her place in such a large family. And because Margaret Sanger basically felt powerless about her place in a family of 11 children and saw her mother possibly going out here and giving birth to over 18 children, as related to the 11 who survived, what this led to Margaret Sanger possibly thinking to herself when she was younger is that the only way to be the center of attention in a home was to go out here and try to control the births of other children. Again, this is the kind of frame of thinking that Margaret Sanger possibly had as related to her place in the family, and this is what led to her wanting to try to control the birth of others. Now, as Margaret Sanger was growing up, she attended Claveret College at the Hudson River Institute, being supported by her two older sisters, and then enrolling in 1900 in White Plains Hospital as a nurse probationer. And in 1902, she married William Sanger, giving up her education as related to nursing, then went on to have 3 children, and then lived in a quiet life in Westchester, New York. Now, what's really contradictory to me is she says she became a part of an Episcopal church, but however, her actions were basically diametrically opposed to the church and everything as related to the Bible later on in her life. And in 1911, Margaret Sanger's home on Hastings-on-Hudson was destroyed, and she abandoned the suburbs to move to New York City. And as she moved to New York City, she was working as a visiting nurse on the slums of the East Side, while her husband worked as an architect and a painter. Now, the couple was a part of leftist socialist politics, and Margaret Sanger, being a feminist, went out here and joined the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party, taking part in actions like the Industrial Workers of the World, and the 1912 textile strike, the 1913 silk strike, and getting involved with socialists and activists of the time like John Reed, Upton Sinclair, Mabel Dodge, and Emma Goldman. And Sanger, basically at that time, was focused on pushing feminist narratives as related to her nursing experience, which really wasn't complete because she never really graduated, and started writing columns on sex education, talking about what every mother should know and what every girl should know in the socialist magazine, The New York Call. So she was out here openly trying to talk about sex and sexuality during a time when people were very formal and discreet as related to talking about such matters. and was looking to go out here and trying to make more messages again to women about having control over their bodies, and again basically looking to try to get control because she felt like she lost control about being a part of that larger family. Now, as Margaret Sanger was in New York City, she was doing work as a nurse among working class immigrant women who underwent frequent childbirth, miscarriages, and self-induced abortions for allegedly lack of information on how to avoid an unwanted pregnancy. Now, according to Margaret Sanger, people weren't getting enough information about how to avoid an unwanted pregnancy, and the easiest way to avoid an unwanted pregnancy was just not to have sex with a man. That was the easiest way to avoid a pregnancy. And the whole thing is, even this is what Margaret Sanger was trying to fight against. And according to her, access to contraceptive information was prohibited on the grounds of the obscenity laws of the 1873 federal Comstock law and state laws. And Margaret Sanger wanted to go out here and get information to help women about contraception. However, that information was not available as related to contraception because contraceptives such as diaphragms and condoms at the time were actually considered to be illegal. And they were considered to be illegal at the time because at the time in America, sex was basically supposed to be reserved for marriage, and it was supposed to be a part of consummating a marriage. So a lot of people who were saying that they were having these frequent childbirths and frequent pregnancies, this was basically either because the husband basically was having sex with his wife and was bearing children, and due to the low mortality rates, a lot of people wanted to have lots of children because they didn't know if their children were going to die. And a lot of times there were other women out here being sexually promiscuous, and again, this was considered to be a consequence as related to sexual promiscuity at the time. But Margaret Sanger wanted to go out here and be able to try to help women supposedly as related to getting them birth control, and she wanted to go out here and try. And one of the cases that led to her being motivated to do this was the case of a woman named Sadie Sachs, who had become ill after a self-induced abortion. Now, Sadie begged the doctor to tell her how she could prevent this from happening again, and the doctor told her to remain abstinent. Now, I don't know if this Sadie Sachs was single or married, but this was the thing that is the easiest way to avoid a unwanted pregnancy, is to go out here and just not have sex with this man. But what Margaret Sanger saw this as a way to go out here and try to push for birth control, because she felt like birth control had nothing to do with self-control, and she wanted to go out here, and she just got frustrated about working with women and wanted to focus on this whole campaign as related to birth control. Now, this whole argument as related to birth control and contraception basically led to the deterioration of Margaret Sanger's marriage to her husband, and this basically led to Margaret Sanger and her husband basically winding up to the point where things just deteriorated between them, and things deteriorated between Margaret Sanger and her husband, William Sanger, because she did not want to submit to the authority of her husband, and because she didn't want to submit to the authority of her husband and was out here being a feminist and looking to get more control over herself as a woman, this drove her further down the road to becoming a woman in crisis in 1913, when she became estranged from her husband, and she wound up becoming estranged from her husband because she did not want to submit to his authority as a man, and because she didn't want to submit to his authority as a man, this is what led to her looking to become more of a feminist and more radicalized as a feminist, to the point where, again, she just walked away from her husband and her 3 kids, and they separated in 1913, and then in 1921 she divorced, which was a major thing back in the 1920s, because divorcing a husband, that was a major shame for a woman, but for a feminist, divorcing a husband is something that they considered to be empowering. And in 1922 she married another man a beta male, Norman H. Slee, who supported her in all of her campaigns as related to going out here and pushing for birth control. Now, in 1914, Margaret Sanger launched a newsletter talking about no gods, no masters, collaborating with anarchist friends, talking about the term birth control, and looking to talk about family limitation. And the whole thing, again, this is all about her feeling powerless as related to her place in the family. And she felt the only way for a woman to go out here and feel like she had power was to go out here and be the absolute mistress over her own body. And again, Margaret Sanger tried to use the argument saying that this was about free speech, but even though these type of discussions were basically not something that people wanted to talk about, and they were considered to be obscene to the point where Margaret Sanger was indicted for violating postal obscenity laws for sending out her newsletter, The Woman Rebel, and instead of being prosecuted, she wound up fleeing the country and staying in England. And as she stayed in England, she then talked about things about overpopulation leading to poverty, famine, and war. And again, this was her basically trying to create a straw man argument, because what she was upset about was the fact that, again, she was didn't have a place in her own family, and then because as a result of this, she wound up losing the family she had with her husband, and now she was out here on her own, and again, trying to make the argument saying, oh, that this is going to lead to overpopulation, when the whole thing that leads to that there was no such thing as overpopulation, because the Most High chooses who gets born. And this basically started to show the hubris of Margaret Sanger, who wanted to go out here and wanted to be while she said no gods, no masters in her slogans, she wanted to be a god and a master over people, because she felt powerless about her own, again, ability to go out here and be a helpmeet to a man and be responsible for managing a home, because she felt invisible about her home when she was a child. And again, this is what led to her going out here and looking to go to England and trying to avoid the government, and then basically came back in 1915, where she wound up getting flipped by her ex-husband, who then sent a one of her things to an anti-vice politician, and they wound up getting her convicted, spending 30 days in jail when she returned to America. And then she wound up while pushing interests of birth control and the issue of civil liberty. And this is where her beta male husband started to begin to help her, smuggling diaphragms through New York, through Canada, in boxes labeled 3-in-1 oil. And later on, this beta male went on to become a diaphragm manufacturer, and just shows me again the lengths a beta male will go in order to try to gain the favor of a woman who had no interest in helping him at all. And this just shows again how she wanted to be the head of the family and be the head of the leader of the household. And again, this is all part of what makes Margaret Sanger a woman in crisis. She's a feminist woman who wanted to go out here and have control over birth and over men, because she felt, again, powerless about her ability to be a part of a family, so she wanted to control other people's families. So what happened was Margaret Sanger then began learning about diaphragms and birth control messages and sponges and stuff, and wanted to start bringing this stuff back to the United States, because they weren't available due to the Comstock law. And again, she went out here and then in 1916 opened up her birth control clinic. And as she opened up this birth control clinic, she began seeing women. And eventually what happened was the police then came to her and had her arrested, and then had her charged with being a public nuisance. And at this time, this is where Margaret Sanger went to work in a workhouse, but went on a hunger strike, but was force-fed. The first woman hunger striker to be force-fed as related to things. Again, Margaret Sanger continued to push as related to birth control, and she continued to push for birth control even going on to the point where she started to go into the black community. And this is where I have a real issue with Margaret Sanger and bootlegs like W.E.B. Du Bois and New York's Urban League, which allowed her to open up a clinic in Harlem. But the whole thing is, every other place that she tried to open up these clinics, she ran into resistance and was arrested. But she was able to go out here and do this in the black community with the support of black leaders and the NAACP, the W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the part of the NAACP, and also with the support of many black pastors. They went out here and supported Margaret Sanger as related to her birth control agenda, an anti-black agenda that was meant to try to minimize the number of black pregnancies and black births, because the black family was growing strong. And this was the thing was that we had more black families with people married than whites at the time. And again, Margaret Sanger didn't like the idea of this. And while they tried to say Margaret Sanger was all against bigotry, she basically was a racist and a white supremacist, because she came to black communities with this agenda. And again, if she went to any other group, she would be pushed back on. And she talked about birth control to the Ku Klux Klan in New Jersey. Again, shows me, she talked about, she would go out here and speak to this group. And again, just shows me how much of a racist this woman was. And again, this woman was a racist who basically wanted to go out here and talk about birth control as related to black people, and also was supportive of campaigns like eugenics, believing that certain people did not need to be born. And then again, this is all about her needing to want to go out here and push narratives to destroy families. And as she looked to destroy families, she went out here talking about so-called birth control as related to contraception, and even fought all the way up to the courts in 1936 and led to the court decision that overturned the Comstock laws, which prohibited physicians from getting contraceptions. And this led to contraception becoming a normal medical product, like condoms and diaphragms being distributed everywhere. And this basically opened the door for sexual promiscuity to become the norm in America as related to the sexual revolution. Because thanks to Margaret Sanger and her campaigns for birth control, this is what led to the opening of the door for sexual promiscuity in this country. Because again, she took sex out of marriage, which was what it was a part of, because originally sex was supposed to be a part of consummating a marriage, because sex was how a man would go out here and present his seed to be spread to his wife to bear him children. So Margaret Sanger basically made it where instead of us thinking of sex as something that was a part of marriage, people thought of it as something that people did as related to their sexual urges. And she promoted the whole idea of men and women going out here and being able to get access to birth control without taking responsibility for themselves. So she wanted to go out here and open the door for sexual promiscuity for most Western women. And again, this is why Margaret Sanger was a woman in crisis. A woman in crisis who again went out here and promoted sexual promiscuity, talking about birth control being a way to stop unwanted pregnancies, when the solution for unwanted pregnancies was for that man and that woman not to have sex at all until they got married. Because premarital sex is one of the things that leads to a lot of women winding up becoming women in crisis, because as they lay down with men and go out here and those men put their spirit and DNA in those women, like Ringo talks about, what happens is that woman bonds with that man, and then what happens is if she has multiple partners, she winds up with a whole lot of spirits in her, and again lines up with the DNA and the spirits of those men fighting against her and pulling at her and tearing at her soul. And this is something Margaret Sanger didn't want to think about, because she was still dealing with the trauma as related to the place of being invisible in her family, and she sought to rectify this by going out here and taking a way to try to take control of other people's families, but that put the entire nation on the road to becoming women in crisis. And again, as she was looking to make the nation a nation of women in crisis, she also wanted to exterminate the black race through supporting things like eugenics. And again, this is where Margaret Sanger, again, wanted to go out here and wage a campaign by opening up that place in Harlem. Now, a lot of people think Margaret Sanger was all about abortion, but she wasn't about abortion. She was about birth control. And again, she was about birth control as related to eugenics. And she wanted to go out here and get rid of those people who she thought was unfit. And again, that's what is audacious about Margaret Sanger. She thought that, oh, people have a right to decide who gets to live and who gets to die, and working with eugenicists, especially against black people. And again, this is why Margaret Sanger is a reprehensible human being. And again, she was a woman in crisis. And again, her road to becoming a woman in crisis had to do with the dysfunctional family she was a part of. Her father was an atheist, and her mother was a leftist, and she became a leftist feminist who basically shows how much of a white supremacist she was as related to the contempt she showed black people. And again, this woman wanted to control the births of women, but created the sexual promiscuity that many women participate in today that leads to most women out here becoming women in crisis. Now, this was a video requested by one of my viewers, and if you want to request a historical women in crisis video, you can send a donation to the PayPal or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to learn what leads to so many women winding up on the road to becoming women in crisis like Margaret Sanger, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis at other online booksellers like Smashware's The iBook Store and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.